Big Shaq walks into a high-end store expecting a normal day, but one racist lie turns it into a public showdown. A privileged Karen, desperate for control, falsely accuses him of shoplifting. Whispers spread, security moves in. The store turns against him. But Shaq isn't just any man. He's ready to flip the script. And when the truth comes out, Karen's world crumbles in front of everyone. One video. One moment. Justice hits harder than she ever expected. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh as Big Shaq stepped into Riverton Luxury Department Store, a place that screamed exclusivity. Bright chandeliers hung overhead, polished marble floors reflected the warm glow of expensive lighting, and neatly arranged designer displays sat untouched, as if they were art pieces rather than products for sale. Shaq had been in plenty of high-end stores before, as a customer, a business mogul, and a man who had long surpassed the need to check price tags. But still, the moment he stepped inside, he felt it. That shift in energy, the way eyes lingered on him just a little too long, the way employees stiffened behind the counters, suddenly more alert than they had been moments ago, the way a few customers glanced at him, then at each other, whispering just out of earshot. Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his posture relaxed, pretending not to notice. This wasn't new. It never was. He was used to standing out. How could he not? At 7 feet 1 inch, broad-shouldered and dressed in a sleek black hoodie and tailored jeans, he towered over everyone in the store. He could have been wearing a 3-piece suit, and it wouldn't have mattered. To them, he was still a black man in a space that wasn't built for him. He walked past a glass case of luxury watches, casually glancing at them. Not because he wanted one, he had a collection at home, but because he liked seeing how different brands marketed their products. A nearby sales associate, a slim young man in a fitted blazer, subtly adjusted his tie and stepped closer. Not to greet Shaq, not to ask if he needed assistance, just to watch. Shaq smirked to himself. Same game, different day. Just then, another presence entered the store. Karen Hollingsworth. She walked in like she owned the place, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. A woman in her mid-50s, with icy blonde hair cut into a perfect bob, a tailored white coat, and a pearl necklace resting just below her throat. Everything about her screamed old money, entitlement, and superiority. Karen loved this store. It was one of her spaces, her kind of place. A world where she felt comfortable, where she belonged. And when she saw Shaq, she immediately decided that he didn't. She didn't recognize him, not as a celebrity, a businessman, or a cultural icon. She just saw a tall black man in a hoodie, and in her mind that meant one thing: trouble. Karen tightened her grip on her designer handbag, pressing it closer to her body as she walked past Shaq. He noticed. He always noticed. The way women like Karen did the little things, the way their noses wrinkled just slightly, the way their pace quickened when they passed him, the way their hands instinctively reached for their belongings, as if he was some kind of threat, simply for existing in the same space as them. Shaq didn't react. He had long ago learned that reacting only made it worse. Instead, he continued browsing, stopping at a display of leather wallets, flipping one open, feeling the grain of the material between his fingers. Karen watched from a few feet away, her eyes narrowing. She had seen men like him before, or so she thought. Big, imposing, and out of place. The kind of man who might pretend to shop, only to slip something into his pocket when no one was looking. Karen wasn't the only one watching. The sales associate, still standing a few feet away, glanced at Shaq, then at Karen, as if waiting for confirmation. And then, the moment happened. Shaq shifted his stance, adjusting his hoodie slightly, just enough for Karen to convince herself that she had seen something. Her lips pursed, and her heart started to race, but not with fear. No, this was excitement, because Karen loved playing the hero. She turned, spotting a woman nearby, a younger shopper probably in her early 30s. Karen leaned in, her voice hushed but urgent. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The woman blinked. "See what?" Karen nodded toward Shaq. "That man over there, he just put something in his pocket." The younger woman frowned, clearly unsure. Are you sure? Karen placed a hand on her chest, feigning concern. I know what I saw. And just like that, the seed was planted. It didn't take much. Karen knew how these situations worked. A woman like her, well-dressed, well-spoken, and visibly concerned, could say almost anything, and people would listen. The whisper spread. The younger woman glanced at Shaq, her own eyes now filled with suspicion. Another shopper picked up on the tension. An employee at the perfume counter subtly tapped his coworker, nodding in Shaq's direction. Security, who had been casually monitoring the store from the far side, shifted position, standing a little closer. Shaq, still browsing, felt it all happening in real time. The shift, the weight of unspoken accusations settling onto his shoulders. And just like that, what had started as a regular day had turned into something dangerous. Shaq knew this feeling well. He had felt it as a teenager, when a store clerk followed him and his friends around a sneaker shop. He had felt it as a young athlete, when a security guard asked him if he could afford that while he was buying a watch. And now, as a grown man, a multimillionaire, a legend in his own right, he was feeling it again. Being watched, being judged, being assumed guilty. Shaq clenched his jaw, inhaling deeply. He wasn't about to play into their expectations. He knew how this worked. If he got angry, he was the aggressive black man. If he got defensive, they'd assume he had something to hide. So instead, he stayed exactly where he was. The inevitable confrontation approaches. Karen, growing bolder, stepped closer to an employee. Her voice was low but urgent. You need to do something, she insisted. I saw him take something. The employee hesitated. They hadn't seen anything. But Karen was persistent. What if he leaves? She pressed. Do you really want to be responsible for that? The worker faltered, then gave a small nod. And just like that, the decision was made. Security started moving. The tension in the air thickened. Shaq, still standing calmly by the wallets, knew what was about to happen. And this time, he was ready. Because he wasn't just another black man in a luxury store. He was Big Shaq, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. Shaq had felt eyes on him before, but this time, it was different. The weight of silent judgment hung in the air like an unspoken rule, one that only applied to people like him. He could see it in the sideways glances of the employees, their forced smiles quickly fading the moment he turned away. He could hear it in the hushed whispers behind the perfume counter, where two clerks exchanged a look as if silently confirming their suspicions. And he could feel it in the way Karen clutched her designer purse tighter, shifting her stance, making sure the store staff could see her discomfort. It was an old game, a familiar script. And Shaq knew exactly where this was heading. He had seen one of the employees step away earlier, phone in hand, pretending to be busy. But he wasn't texting a friend or checking inventory. He was reporting something, or more specifically, reporting someone. Shaq. The man who, in their minds, didn't belong here. A few feet away, Karen's breath hitched, dramatic and calculated, as she adjusted her pearl necklace with a delicate, rehearsed motion. She wasn't afraid. She was performing. Playing the victim before there was even a crime. Shaq knew this too. He had lived through this script 100 times before. And now, it was happening again. Shaq continued browsing, keeping his movements slow, deliberate, controlled. Then, just as he reached for another wallet, a shadow moved beside him. A store clerk. A young man in his mid-20s, blonde hair neatly combed, dressed in a crisp suit, standing just a little too stiffly. Sir, can I help you? The words were polite, but the tone was not. There was no warmth in it, no genuine offer of assistance, only skepticism. Shaq had heard this same question in 100 different ways. In a sneaker store as a teenager, when an employee had asked it 5 times in 10 minutes, but never offered help to the white kid standing next to him. At a jewelry boutique years ago, when a salesperson had subtly hovered behind him, watching his every move. And now, here. Shaq turned slightly, meeting the clerk's gaze. His expression didn't shift. He didn't frown. He didn't let the frustration show. Because if he did, it would be used against him. So, instead, he simply said, "Just looking." The clerk hesitated, as if waiting for Shaq to say more, to justify his presence. But Shaq wasn't about to play along. The silence stretched just a little too long before the clerk finally forced a tight-lipped smile and stepped back. But he didn't leave. He just lingered nearby, watching, waiting. Karen, standing a few feet away, caught everything. She saw how the clerk didn't fully trust Shaq. She saw how the employees were already on edge. And in that moment, she made a calculated decision. She leaned toward the woman next to her, a stranger, another shopper, just someone she could pull into her illusion. Her voice was soft, just above a whisper. "Did you see that?" The woman turned, brows furrowing. "See what?" Karen sighed, as if burdened with concern. "That man over there, I think he just put something in his pocket." She didn't say his name. She didn't point directly at him. She didn't have to. The woman followed her gaze, locking onto Shaq's broad frame, her expression shifting from neutral to uncertain. The seed had been planted, and it was already growing. The woman turned to her husband, nudging him. Karen leaned toward another shopper, lowering her voice. Within seconds, the ripple effect began. Shaq could hear it happening, the shift in tone, the quiet murmurs, the way people started glancing in his direction, then quickly looking away. The weight of being falsely accused, without a single word spoken to him. Shaq clenched his jaw, inhaling deeply. This wasn't about evidence. This wasn't about facts. This was about assumptions. The way people like Karen controlled the narrative before he even had a chance to speak. By now, the store's security guard had caught on to the tension. A tall, stocky man in a black uniform, standing near the entrance, scanning the room. Karen made sure she caught his eye. She didn't need to call for help. She didn't need to say anything else. She simply let her expression, her carefully manufactured fear, do all the work for her. And just like that, the guard started moving. Shaq could sense the moment everything shifted against him. The way the air felt tighter. The way the employees moved slower, glancing at him every few seconds. The way customers stood near exits, not wanting to be involved, but too curious to leave. He had done nothing wrong. But that didn't matter. Because when fear and racism mix, the truth stops being important. And Shaq? He was about to be put on trial, without a single piece of evidence against him. Karen's pulse quickened with anticipation. This was her moment, the moment she had manufactured. She had turned an ordinary day into suspicion. She had made herself the victim, even when there was no crime. And now, she was about to watch it all unfold. She straightened her shoulders, already imagining the headlines, already picturing herself telling the story later, how she had stood her ground and done the right thing. She could already hear the praise, and she had no idea what was about to happen next. The security guard cleared his throat. The store manager stepped forward, and all around, the crowd held its breath. Karen's whisper had done its job, and now Shaq was about to be confronted, accused, judged, treated like a criminal. All because one woman decided he didn't belong. Shaq exhaled slowly, bracing himself. Because if they thought he was going to go down quietly, they were about to learn exactly who they were dealing with. Shaq had seen it coming, the weight of suspicion, the way the whispers spread, the shift in energy around him. He had felt it before it even happened. But he refused to change his behavior. He wasn't about to shrink himself to make others comfortable. So he continued browsing. He reached for a sleek black leather wallet, flipping it open, running his fingers over the texture. A normal action. A normal moment. But in the eyes of Karen Hollingsworth, it was the confirmation she needed. And she seized her moment. Karen took a sharp breath, loud enough to be heard by anyone within 10 feet. She clutched her chest, stepping back as if she had just witnessed a crime in real time. "Oh my God," she whispered, just loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. A couple turned toward her, alarm flashing in their eyes. Karen's gaze darted toward a nearby store employee, a young woman with a name tag that read, Danielle. With panic perfectly performed, Karen hurried to Danielle's side, gripping her arm lightly as if she were shaking. "You need to do something," she insisted, voice trembling with a well-practiced mix of fear and authority. Danielle blinked, confused. "Ma'am, what's wrong?" Karen dramatically glanced over her shoulder at Shaq, who was still examining the wallet, completely unaware of the storm about to crash down on him. Then she dropped the bombshell. "That man over there. I just saw him put something in his pocket." Silence spread like a shockwave. It started at the counter, where the cashier paused mid-scan, the beeping of the register abruptly stopping. A woman near the perfume aisle glanced up, her fingers tightening around a bottle of Chanel No. 5. A couple looking at watches exchanged nervous glances. And then, slowly but surely, every single pair of eyes turned toward Shaq. He felt it before he heard it. The way the energy in the store shifted. The way the weight of 100 silent judgments settled onto his shoulders. Shaq glanced up, meeting stares that were no longer casual glances but full, scrutinizing gazes. His jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Because he knew how this worked. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that he could buy this entire store without blinking. One accusation. That's all it took. And he was already on trial. Karen wasn't done yet. She played her role perfectly, placing a hand on her chest like a shaken bystander who had just witnessed something terrible. "I saw him," she said, louder now. "He took something. He put it in his pocket when he thought no one was looking." Shaq exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting to Danielle, the store clerk Karen had grabbed. Danielle looked uncomfortable, like she didn't know what to believe. Shaq met her eyes, his expression unreadable. Danielle hesitated. Then, she reached for the store's intercom. I think we need security at the men's accessories section," she said hesitantly. Shaq could feel his stomach tighten. Here we go. It didn't take long. Within seconds, the heavy thud of boots echoed against the polished floor as two security guards approached. One was short and stocky, mid-50s with a serious expression. The other was taller, younger, but just as tense. Both of them had already decided something was wrong. Neither asked Shaq if he needed help. Neither asked for his side of the story. Instead, the older guard stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. "Sir," he said, voice firm, "I'm going to need you to step away from the display." Shaq's fingers curled into a loose fist, but he kept his face calm. "I'm just looking," he said, his voice even. The guard exchanged a glance with his partner, then flicked his gaze toward Karen. She stepped forward eagerly, her self-righteousness practically dripping off her like expensive perfume. "I saw him take something," she said, her voice now an outraged whisper. "I swear, you should check him. I feel unsafe." There it was. The magic words. I feel unsafe. Shaq hadn't touched her, hadn't even spoken to her, but now he was dangerous. The store held its breath. A mother pulled her child closer. An elderly man near the shoe section whispered something to his wife. Shaq could see the narrative writing itself in real time. A wealthy woman, a suspicious man, a frightened store full of people. Shaq took a slow breath, holding his temper. He had been here before. If he raised his voice, he'd be aggressive. If he got angry, he'd be a threat. But that didn't mean he was going to bow his head and accept this. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice low but firm. "Check the cameras." The older security guard hesitated. Karen wasn't expecting that. "Check the cameras," Shaq repeated, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "If you think I stole something, prove it." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. The younger security guard shifted uncomfortably. The weight of truth had been placed back in their hands, and suddenly the situation wasn't as simple as they had thought. Before anyone could speak, another voice cut through the air. "What's going on here?" The store manager. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a navy blue blazer, approaching with authority and concern. Karen turned to her instantly, seizing control before anyone else could. "This man," she said, gesturing dramatically to Shaq, "was stealing. I saw it with my own eyes." The manager turned to Shaq. She didn't look at him like a thief. She looked at him like a problem she now had to deal with. "Sir," she said carefully, "if you'd just empty your pockets." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "You serious?" Her jaw tightened. "It'll clear this up quickly." Shaq exhaled sharply, He could have walked out. He could have yelled, made a scene, demanded justice. But he knew what was stronger than anger. Proof. So, he did it. He slowly reached into his pockets, empty. Then he turned around and spread his arms. "I've got nothing to hide," he said, his voice deep and unwavering. "But I think she does." And then? The manager turned to the security cameras. Karen froze. Because she had just realized her lies were about to be exposed. Shaq had barely finished turning out his empty pockets when the tension in the store spiked. The security guards were already on edge, their stances rigid, hands resting near their radios. The store manager standing beside Karen didn't look convinced. Not yet. And Karen? She saw her perfect moment, her opportunity to flip the script, to play the victim. She took a step back, her eyes going wide, her breath catching in her throat. And then, in a shaky, almost panicked voice, she said it. The words that could change everything. I don't feel safe," she stammered, placing a hand on her chest. "He's getting aggressive." A murmur rippled through the store. Customers shifted uneasily. The guards reacted instantly, stepping forward, closing the space around Shaq. Their hands weren't on their weapons, but the message was clear. They weren't protecting him. They were containing him. Shaq's jaw tightened. He knew this game. He had seen countless videos of situations just like this, where perception mattered more than truth. Karen had accused him, and now she was afraid of him. It didn't matter that he hadn't done a single thing wrong. The accusation was enough. Shaq's frustration reaches its peak. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice controlled, measured, calm. "You really think I need to steal?" The words were careful, but the frustration underneath was undeniable. Karen flinched dramatically, as if the question itself was some kind of attack. The guards didn't answer. The store manager hesitated, eyes flicking between Karen and Shaq, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Shaq saw it happening in real time. This was the moment, the turning point. If they chose to believe Karen's fear, he was done. Karen, seeing the hesitation, pushed forward. "He's lying," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. She pointed a shaking hand at Shaq. "I saw him take something. I saw him hide it, and now he's trying to intimidate me." Her voice cracked at the end, fake but convincing. It worked. A customer gasped quietly. A woman instinctively stepped back. The younger security guard looked uncertain now, his grip tightening on his belt. Shaq clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. It didn't matter that his pockets were empty. It didn't matter that the truth was on his side. Because in this moment, the lie was winning. For a long, tense second, no one moved. No one spoke. The store manager was thinking. The security guards were waiting. The customers were watching. And Shaq? He was standing in the middle of it all, caught in a moment that felt far too familiar. Then finally, "Check the cameras." Shaq's voice was low, steady, unshaken. The store manager blinked. "Excuse me?" Shaq met her eyes, unwavering. "Check the cameras," he repeated. "You got security footage, right?" The older security guard hesitated. Karen stiffened. For the first time, her confidence wavered. Because if they did check the cameras, they wouldn't see him stealing. They'd see her setting him up. The store manager glanced at Karen, then at Shaq, then back at Karen. And for the first time, Shaq saw it, the doubt in her eyes. The realization that maybe, just maybe, Karen wasn't telling the truth. The older security guard sighed, shifting his stance. "We can check the footage," he muttered. Karen's breath hitched. The younger guard looked at her, suddenly uncertain. I don't think that's necessary," Karen stammered. She turned toward the store manager. "Do we really need to waste time reviewing footage when I was right here?" "I saw him." The manager held up a hand, cutting her off. "We checked the cameras," she said firmly. Karen's face drained of color. Because in that instant, she knew she had lost control, and the truth was about to come out. Shaq had faced pressure before, in championship games, on billion-dollar business deals, even in moments where people expected him to fail. But this kind of pressure? This was different. Because it didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that he had emptied his pockets, proving he hadn't taken a thing. Karen had already poisoned the air with suspicion, and now, every person in the store was waiting for him to react. But he wouldn't give them what they wanted. He wouldn't give Karen what she wanted. So instead, he did what he always did. He stayed calm. The tension in the store felt suffocating. Some customers pretended to shop, but their eyes kept flicking toward the unfolding scene. A young woman near the perfume counter leaned toward her friend. "Do you think he really stole something?" The friend hesitated. "I don't know. But why would she lie?" On the other side of the store, an older man frowned. "That's Shaquille O'Neal," he whispered to his wife. "Why in the world would he need to steal?" His wife, clutching her purse, wasn't convinced. Doesn't matter how much money someone has. You never really know people. And that was the problem. Shaq wasn't just fighting Karen. He was fighting every silent doubt, every unspoken stereotype, every person who had already decided his innocence or guilt, without knowing a single fact. Karen could sense the uncertainty, and she knew how to twist it to her advantage. She turned back to the store manager, her voice quivering with frustration and faux disbelief. "I can't believe we're even debating this," she scoffed. "You saw how aggressive he got with me, and now we're supposed to just take his word?" She folded her arms, shaking her head. "If we don't check the security footage, we're basically saying that anyone can walk in here and do whatever they want." It was a smart move. She wasn't just asking them to check the footage anymore. She was challenging the store manager's authority. She was pushing the store into a corner, because if they didn't check, they'd look weak. The manager sighed, clearly frustrated by the situation. She turned to Shaq. "Would you be okay with us reviewing the footage?" Shaq didn't hesitate. He met her gaze, unwavering. "Go ahead," he said. "I've got nothing to hide." Something shifted in that moment. Shaq could feel it. It wasn't just the way he said it, calm, direct, completely unshaken. It was the fact that he welcomed it. A guilty man would have argued, gotten defensive, tried to dodge the situation. But Shaq? He was inviting the truth. The security guard who had been skeptical shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the jewelry section whispered to her husband, "If he's saying that, maybe he really didn't do anything." Even the store manager hesitated, realizing that Shaq wasn't acting like a man who had been caught. He was acting like a man who had been falsely accused. And for the first time, Karen felt her control slipping. She couldn't let this happen. She had set the stage perfectly. She had played the role of the concerned citizen, the frightened victim, the woman who had spoken up against wrongdoing. She had expected Shaq to react differently, to get angry, to refuse, to cause a scene. That would have been easier for her. But now she could feel the power shifting back to him, and she refused to let that happen. So she did what people like her always did when the truth started to work against them. She doubled down. I don't understand why we're wasting time," she blurted out, her voice rising slightly. "Even if the cameras don't catch him, that doesn't mean he didn't do it." Silence. A deep, heavy, awkward silence. Shaq's eyebrows lifted slightly. The store manager's lips pressed together. The security guard blinked. "Wait. What?" Karen realized too late that she had said the quiet part out loud, that she had just exposed her own bias in front of everyone, that this had never been about the truth for her. She had already made up her mind, and now, so had everyone else. The store manager took a deep breath, her shoulders tense with exhaustion. She had been pulled into a situation she never wanted to be a part of. And now, she had a choice. She could continue to play along with Karen's delusion, or she could end this. She turned to the security guard. "Pull the footage," she said, her voice final, decisive. Karen's face drained of color. Because she knew. This was the moment everything would fall apart. The store fell silent as the manager's words settled in. "Pull the footage." The air felt heavier, thick with tension. Karen froze, her well-crafted illusion cracking around her. Shaq remained still, composed, but his sharp gaze was locked on Karen, watching, waiting. The security guard nodded, motioning for his partner to follow him toward the back office. And then, the wait began. No one moved. No one spoke. Customers stood in awkward silence, their eyes darting between Shaq and Karen. A few whispered, low and cautious. A man near the electronics section muttered, "If he really stole something, wouldn't he be more nervous?" A woman next to him, clutching a designer purse, whispered back, "And why would someone like him even need to steal?" But some weren't convinced yet. An older gentleman near the jewelry counter folded his arms, sighing. You never know with people. Just because someone's rich doesn't mean they don't do things. Karen's fingers trembled, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. She needed control. She needed to regain the upper hand. And she had to do it before that footage came back. She turned toward the store manager, her voice tight and urgent. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "You're really going to waste time reviewing footage instead of trusting me? I saw him." Her voice rose, high-pitched and strained. A few customers flinched at the desperation creeping into her tone. The manager didn't budge. "Ma'am, we'll know the truth in just a few minutes," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "If he took something, the footage will show it." Karen let out a harsh laugh, but it sounded forced. "What if the cameras didn't catch everything?" she blurted out. A few people turned to look at her. Shaq, still standing tall, let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. That was it. The moment she realized she was losing. Because now, it was obvious she was scrambling. And then, the security guard returned, holding a tablet in his hands. "All right," the guard said, his voice neutral, unreadable. "We have the footage." Everyone tensed. The manager, Shaq, Karen, and a few curious customers gathered around as the guard tapped the screen, playing back the last 10 minutes. The first thing that appeared? Shaq. He stood exactly where he had been, flipping through a leather wallet, inspecting it. Then he set it back down. He never once put anything in his pockets. He never once made any suspicious movements. Shaq watched Karen through the corner of his eye. She wasn't blinking. Her mouth was slightly open, her hands gripping the strap of her purse like a lifeline. But it wasn't over yet, because the footage kept rolling. And then, the real twist came. The camera, positioned high in the corner, caught a moment no one had expected. Karen, standing near a display of silk scarves, looking over her shoulder, making sure no one was watching. Then, swiftly, smoothly, she grabbed a small designer accessory and slid it into her purse. Gasps rippled through the store. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Karen staggered back, her face draining of color. Shaq said nothing. He didn't have to, because the truth had just spoken for itself. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her face flushed red hot, her confidence shattered. The customers who had believed her just moments ago now stared at her like she was a stranger. The woman near the perfume counter shook her head, disgusted. "You accused him," she whispered, "when you were the one stealing." Karen whipped toward the manager, her voice shaking. That's a mistake," she stammered. It must be a trick of the angle." The manager didn't look convinced. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cold now, "please open your purse." Karen held it tighter, stepping back. I don't have to do that," she said quickly. This is insane." But the security guard stepped forward. "Ma'am," he repeated, "open your purse." The entire store was watching. Karen hesitated. Her mind raced. She could walk away, refuse, keep lying. But she could feel it. It wouldn't work this time. She had pushed too far. And now, she was trapped in her own web. With trembling hands, she slowly unzipped her purse. And there it was. The small designer scarf, crumpled at the bottom of her expensive bag. A tangible piece of her guilt. Another round of gasps. Someone let out a low whistle. The older man who had doubted Shaq earlier muttered, "Well, damn." Shaq just watched, silent, unshaken. Because he knew. He had known all along. The store manager sighed, rubbing her temple. "I'm going to have to call the authorities," she muttered. Karen's head snapped up. "What? No. That's not necessary. This was a misunderstanding." The security guard was already on his radio. Karen turned back to Shaq, rage and humiliation burning in her eyes. "This is your fault," she hissed under her breath. Shaq finally spoke. "My fault," he said, his voice low. "You played yourself." Karen flinched, her face twisting in frustration. But she had nowhere to go. No one to back her up. No power left to manipulate. And everyone in that store? They would never forget this moment. Shaq walks away, victorious. The store buzzed with whispers as Karen sank into a seat near the registers, defeated. Shaq let out a slow breath, then turned toward the store manager. "I think we're done here," he said. She nodded, clearly embarrassed. I'm sorry, Mr. O'Neill," she admitted. "We should have handled this differently." Shaq simply nodded. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. As he passed, a few customers gave him respectful nods. A young man near the sneakers section lifted his phone and muttered, "This is going to be all over the internet." And Karen? She just sat there, silent, completely exposed. And for the first time in her life, powerless. The moment the scarf hit the counter, the entire store shifted. Everything Karen had built, her performance, her lies, her self-righteous act, collapsed in an instant. And now, she was exactly what she had accused Shaq of being. A thief, a liar, a fraud. The weight of silent judgment. For the first time since this all started, Karen wasn't in control. And she felt it. The same heavy, unspoken judgment she had forced onto Shaq. Now it was aimed at her. She could see it in their eyes, the disgust, the disbelief. Customers who had once nodded along with her accusations now stood with arms crossed, their expressions twisted in disapproval. Some shook their heads, some whispered, and some, they just glared. A woman near the handbags turned to her friend, whispering, "Can you believe her? The nerve!" The friend scoffed, shaking her head. She was so quick to call him a thief. And now look at her. A man near the checkout folded his arms. People like her always think they can get away with anything. Even the older gentleman, the one who had earlier doubted Shaq, let out a breath, his face tight with regret. "Well," he muttered, "guess I backed the wrong horse." The store employees, who had once stood rigid and alert, now looked like they wanted to disappear. They had believed Karen without question. They had treated Shaq like a suspect. And now, they had to face the consequences of their own bias. Danielle, the young clerk Karen had pulled into her scheme, avoided Shaq's eyes completely. Her hands trembled slightly as she shifted behind the counter, guilt burning her cheeks. The manager stood still, her expression tight, her arms crossed, as if she were trying to hold in the weight of her own embarrassment. She had let Karen dictate the situation. She had nearly humiliated a man who had done nothing wrong. And worst of all, she had almost let the real criminal walk away. The manager cleared her throat, forcing herself to look at Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, her voice low, controlled. I sincerely apologize for what just happened." Shaq tilted his head slightly, waiting. She swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "We should have handled this differently," she admitted. "We should have never assumed." "You did assume." Shaq's voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. The manager winced, because there was nothing she could say to argue that. She had assumed. They all had. And now, the damage was done. Karen couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the stares, the murmurs, the sheer humiliation, it was suffocating her. Her heart pounded as she took a shaky breath, searching for a way out, a way to rewrite the narrative, a way to make herself the victim again. This is a misunderstanding," she said suddenly, her voice high and sharp. No one responded. She licked her lips, stepping forward. "That scarf. I must have dropped it in my purse by accident," she blurted. "I was going to pay for it." A bitter silence followed. No one believed her. A woman near the accessories section scoffed. "Oh, please." A man near the shoes folded his arms. "Now she wants to play innocent?" Karen turned toward them, desperation creeping into her voice. I didn't mean to take it. I was distracted. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Distracted? He repeated, his voice laced with pure disbelief. Karen turned to him, her entitlement flaring up one last time. You don't understand, she snapped, as if somehow she was the one being wronged. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Nah, he said. I understand just fine. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but she didn't get the chance. Because at that moment, the security guard stepped forward, and suddenly, she wasn't just dealing with judgment anymore. She was dealing with consequences. Ma'am, the guard said, his voice firm, we need you to step aside. Karen whipped around, eyes wide. What? No, you don't need to do this. The younger security guard shook his head, disgusted. You were ready to have this man searched and thrown out over a lie, he muttered. But now you want to pass? Karen's breath hitched. The realization hit her all at once. She had lost. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was just another thief getting caught. And the worst part? She had done it to herself. Shaq sighed, looking at Karen one last time. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The store was still buzzing, people murmuring, shaking their heads, pointing at Karen as security led her away. As Shaq reached the doors, a voice called after him. Mr. O'Neill? He turned slightly, finding the store manager standing there, still looking ashamed. We'd like to offer you a... Shaq held up a hand. No need, he said. I don't need anything from you. Then, with the weight of the moment still hanging in the air, he walked out, leaving Karen to face the consequences of her own lies. And for the first time in her life, there was no one left to believe her. Karen had spent years controlling situations like this. She had perfected the act, the fragile victim, the well-spoken authority, the privileged woman whose word was always believed. But this time, she had lost. And worse, the world was about to watch it happen. A young man in a hoodie near the sneaker section pulled out his phone, his camera lens locking onto Karen's pale, trembling face. Yo, he muttered to the woman next to him. This is gonna blow up. He wasn't wrong. Within seconds, 3 more phones were up, recording the aftermath. Karen's frantic expression, the tight grip she had on her designer purse, the way security was closing in. Someone whispered, She accused him, and she's the one getting caught? Oh, this is gold. Another shopper scoffed. This is what happens when you lie. And Karen? She knew. She could feel the weight of every camera, every judgmental stare, every second slipping out of her control. Her fall from grace wasn't just happening, it was being documented. She turned toward the store manager, her voice high, panicked. This is all a misunderstanding, she blurted out. I didn't mean to take it. I was distracted. The excuse barely made it past her lips before a sharp laugh cut through the store. A woman near the perfume counter shook her head. That's the best she's got. Karen's breath hitched. No one was on her side anymore. Not the manager, not the security guards, not the customers who had once believed her. She turned to Shaq, her last desperate attempt at regaining some ground. Tell them, she pleaded. Tell them you believe me. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You don't get to ask me for anything, he said, his voice calm, steady, final. And with those words, Karen's last chance disintegrated. The older security guard stepped forward, his patience long gone. Ma'am, he said, firm, unshaken, we're going to have to escort you out. Karen staggered back like she'd been struck. What? No, you can't. But the younger guard was already reaching for her arm, his grip light but insistent. This is unnecessary, she snapped, trying to keep some dignity, but the crack in her voice betrayed her. Security ignored her. Because for the first time in her life, Karen Hollingsworth was no longer in control. She was being removed, like a problem, like a liability, like someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And Shaq? He watched it all, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just disappointment, because he had seen this story play out before, and it always ended the same way. The whispers followed Karen as she was led toward the exit. The recording phones followed. The quiet gasps and smirks and judgmental stares, the the very same ones she had once weaponized against others, now belonged to her. As she passed a middle-aged woman near the jewelry counter, she heard a quiet tisk. "Looks like karma's got good timing today," the woman muttered. Karen's face burned. She wanted to scream. She wanted to undo this moment. But the doors slid open, and with a final push from security, she was outside. Alone. Exposed. Powerless. And inside? The store was already moving on without her. The air inside the store felt lighter now, like the storm had passed. The tension that had once centered on Shaq was now completely gone. The manager took a deep breath, turning toward him, her guilt heavy in her expression. "Mr. O'Neill," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. Shaq glanced at her, waiting. "I deeply regret what just happened," she said, shifting on her heels. "We should have handled this better." Shaq nodded, but his face remained unreadable. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. Because it wasn't easy. Because it shouldn't have taken a video recording and public humiliation for them to realize what they had done. The manager swallowed. "As a token of our apologies," she continued, "we'd like to offer you any item in the store, on the house." Shaq let out a slow breath. Then, he shook his head. "Keep it," he said simply. The manager blinked. "Excuse me?" Shaq glanced around, at the customers, at the employees, at the security guards who had stood in his way just moments ago. "I don't need anything from this store," he said, his voice calm but cutting. The manager looked uncomfortable. Shaq wasn't yelling. He wasn't angry. And somehow, that made it worse, because it forced everyone to sit with their own guilt. He turned toward the exit, his shoulders relaxed, his steps slow, controlled, and with every second that passed, one thing became painfully clear. Karen had lost. And Shaq? He had won without ever needing to fight. The store had already moved on. Karen was gone, escorted out in disgrace, her lies exposed for everyone to see. But the story? It was just beginning. Before Shaq even stepped outside, the internet had already taken over. The young man who had recorded everything was typing fast, uploading the video with a caption that would soon take over social media. She lied. She got caught. And the world needs to see it. The moment the video hit the internet, it spread like wildfire. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. It didn't take long before millions of people were watching. The comments poured in instantly. "This is exactly why black men are afraid to exist in public spaces. That man is Shaq. Why would he need to steal?" But that's the thing. It was never about theft. It was about perception. Karen's been exposed, and I have zero sympathy. Within an hour, the hashtags were trending. Karen exposed. Protect black men. Truth wins. And just like that, this wasn't just a store incident anymore. It was a national conversation. Shaq felt the shift. He knew what was happening outside these walls. But he wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't interested in Karen's downfall. He was interested in what came next. As he approached the exit, the store manager stepped forward again, guilt heavy in her eyes. "Mr. O'Neill," she started, her voice softer than before. "I just want to say again, we're deeply sorry for what happened." Shaq looked at her for a long moment. Then, he simply nodded. "You should be." Then, he pushed the door open and stepped out. No extra words, no theatrics. Because sometimes, silence speaks the loudest. By the time Shaq got to his car, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Messages, missed calls, notifications piling up. Nate, his longtime friend and business partner, had sent a text. "Nate, man, you're all over the internet." Shaq sighed, shaking his head. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to be the next viral moment about racism and bias. But now, people were watching. And if they were watching, he had a responsibility. Shaq didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove to his office, a sleek, modern space where his team handled his many business ventures. The moment he walked in, everyone turned. A few people had already seen the video. Some looked angry. Some looked sad. And some? They just looked tired. Tired of the same story playing out over and over. Nate stood from his desk, shaking his head. Man, what are we gonna do about this? Shaq didn't hesitate. We talk about it. Nate raised an eyebrow. You sure? You could just let it blow over. Shaq leaned against the table, crossing his arms. Nah. People need to understand what happened today. He pulled out his phone, opened his social media, and started recording. He looked straight into the camera, his face calm but serious. I wasn't gonna say anything, he started. I was just gonna let this moment pass. But after seeing the reaction, I know I can't. He let out a slow breath. What happened today wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. And that's the problem. He shook his head. I walked into a store just like anybody else. I didn't take anything. I didn't do anything. But one person's lie almost turned me into a suspect. He paused, his eyes steady. That's the reality for a lot of black men in this country. Doesn't matter how much money you got. Doesn't matter how successful you are. Some people will always see you as a threat first. He leaned forward slightly. But here's the thing. I didn't fight back with anger. I didn't yell. I didn't lose control. I stood my ground. I let the truth do the work. And in the end, that's what won. His voice softened. I don't care what happens to Karen. That's not my focus. My focus is making sure people see what really happened. My focus is making sure that the next time this happens, because it will happen again, people think twice before jumping to the wrong conclusion. He sat back. So if you're watching this, take a minute. Think about how many times you've seen this story play out, and then ask yourself, when will enough be enough? He ended the video. Within seconds, it was uploaded. And within minutes, the world was listening. The response was immediate. The video exploded, racking up millions of views within hours. Celebrities shared it. News stations picked it up. Activists used it as a teaching moment. But most importantly, people talked. Conversations happened in workplaces, in schools, in families. Some defended Karen. Some called for her arrest. Some simply reflected, for the first time realizing how dangerous a single false accusation could be. Karen's life changed overnight. Her face was everywhere, on news segments, on social media, on discussion panels about racism and privilege. She released a statement through a lawyer. I deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred, she wrote. I never meant to cause harm. Nobody bought it. Her job, gone. Her reputation, destroyed. The life she had once controlled so carefully had crumbled in the span of a few hours. And the irony? She had done it to herself. Shaq's final word days later. Reporters tried to get a final statement from Shaq. They wanted him to drag Karen through the mud, to call for her cancellation, to demand revenge. But Shaq? He just shook his head and said one thing. She got what she gave. Then he walked away. Because at the end of the day, he had already won, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been in his shoes. One lie almost ruined a man's dignity, until the truth set him free. How many times has this story played out without cameras rolling? How many innocent people have been judged before being heard? It's time to stop watching these stories happen and start changing how they end.